Hey, it's Mr. Shrum again, and I'm back with another tutorial, and we are going to look at conserving biodiversity. Last time we talked about diversity in our ecosystems and how that is actually really beneficial, and how systems that are more diverse are better able to adapt and stick around than less biodiverse ecosystems. And we looked at the factors affecting biodiversity, how it has been negatively affected by humans or climate change or a number of things. So now we're going to look at how to conserve that biodiversity. We're going to use evidence and scientific reasoning to choose the best solution to a biodiversity problem. So let's get into the content. As a warm-up, we're asked, conservationists strive to preserve or improve biodiversity in ecosystems, which includes monitoring populations of organisms to detect changes. Name two challenges that scientists may encounter when they're monitoring populations of organisms in the wild, okay? So what are the things that may be a problem for a scientist that wants to preserve or improve biodiversity in ecosystems? Well, money is one. The cost. To effectively monitor populations in the wild, scientists need special equipment such as cameras, computers, GPS monitoring equipment. And that costs money. So that can be a challenge, certainly convincing people that this is a worthy endeavor. Another challenge is accuracy. It's impossible to count every single organism in an ecosystem. For example, like try to count all the ants in your backyard or in a playground nearby. It's just too much. So scientists often work with estimates. It's better to be close than to be precise if it saves you a lot of time or a lot of money. All right, another question. Do you think there are always clear solutions to environmental problems? Explain your response. Well, always is a pretty strong word, and clear is another pretty strong word. So my instinct is to say no. And our sample answer says no, there isn't always a clear solution. Ecosystems are quite complex and every solution has consequences. These consequences can affect another part of the ecosystem, or they can negatively affect human economies or industries. There's the intro video. But let's get into the first topic, monitoring populations. Some environmental threats, such as natural disasters and deforestation, are easy to see with our own eyes, while other changes are more subtle and hard to notice up front. Sometimes scientists find these hidden threats because of population changes in an ecosystem. So in this section, we'll look at some ways to monitor biodiversity in a region. That was a forest fire, I think. This little picture is of a Panamanian golden frog, and it's an endangered species. So monitoring that population can help conserve them. And the importance of monitoring populations, there are many reasons why scientists do this. This process can help scientists evaluate how changes in the environment affect populations of organisms. It also helps scientists assess a threatened or endangered species. Population monitoring helps scientists determine the effectiveness of a conservation program. It can also aid in determining whether a new species has entered an ecosystem. Scientists can use population monitoring tools to determine the type of species that live in an ecosystem that have never been researched. These tools can also help scientists identify trends in genetics, especially natural selection trends and the appearance of new traits and genetic mutations. So, yeah, a couple cool things that can come about if you monitor a population. Now, we talked about some of the challenges before. Size, coloring, and behavior could hinder scientists' ability to detect and monitor populations. Rugged terrain and restricted areas are examples of how habitat can pose a challenge to the monitoring program. Scientists use many different methods to monitor a population. Knowing which method is suitable or best for the situation will depend on the type of organism being monitored and the objective of the program. So what is it actually trying to do by monitoring these populations? Scientists must also consider the challenges that a particular species or habitat presents to the monitoring process. Let's look at some methods that scientists use for population monitoring. And this picture over here is a large-tailed nightjar bird. Camouflages itself, which makes it difficult for scientists to assess its population because it's good at hiding. So that helps it survive, but it doesn't help scientists look for them. So here we go. Here are, I think, 5, 6, 7 examples of methods. So let's start with the first one. Canopy fogging. So fogging is a useful technique for monitoring insects that live in trees. The canopy fogging procedure consists of spraying low-dose insecticide into trees. Now, this insecticide doesn't harm other animals or plants. It does, however, kill the insects that live in the trees. The insects fall from the tree canopy onto collecting trays on the ground. Fogging provides an easy, efficient way to collect and count individual species that live only in the canopy. The insecticide breaks down quickly and doesn't present a threat to the ecosystem. A disadvantage of fogging is that it kills the insects. It's also useful only for collecting insects that live high in trees. Fogging requires windless conditions to be effective. Lack of wind is important so that the insecticide affects only the targeted trees. Wind would blow the insecticide onto surrounding trees, and that's a no good situation. Fogging must also be done in dry conditions, so no wind and fairly dry. And dry conditions are needed because the insects fall to the ground and hopefully they don't stick to wet leaves. So that's why they need it dry. The next method is netting. Netting is a monitoring method that uses nets to capture organisms. Netting doesn't kill the organisms and they can be released back into the wild. The process allows scientists to get genetic material from organisms. A disadvantage of netting is that it's only suitable for small animals such as birds and fish. Although the nets don't usually kill the organisms, they can still harm or stress them. You see the little birdie in the net? The next method is point counts. The point count method involves a researcher counting the number of individuals seen or heard from a fixed point for a fixed duration of time. The points are predetermined by the researcher and may be randomly or systematically spaced over the area that the research is monitoring. When the allotted time for a point is completed, the researcher moves to the next point, but the researcher can't make note of any detections made while moving from one point to another. An advantage of the point count method is that it doesn't harm organisms. You're merely observing. It's also useful for showing changes over time. A disadvantage of the system is that it shows trends in population only at that specific point in the ecosystem. Also, the accuracy and efficiency of the method is dependent on the effort and detection skills of the researcher. So this is only going to be as effective as the researcher using this method. Some people are just better observers or noticing small details, while others are, more big picture, and they may not pick up on the little things. Area searches is the next method. These are similar to point count method, but the researcher doesn't observe from a fixed location. So instead, the researcher walks to cover all parts of the area. So they'll walk through this area and then make notes as they go. So an advantage of area searches is that the method gives information from a wider range than point counting. Point counting was just one point and then observing from that. But area research is you're looking at more ground. It's useful to show changes in population over time. However, like the point count method, it gives information specific to only that area. Quadrat sampling. A quadrat is a rectangular or square plot area marked with a frame or stakes and string. The size of the quadrat depends on the species under observation and the type of habitat. The researcher records the number of individuals of the species detected inside the quadrat. The researcher repeats the exercise using the same size quadrat in different locations within the habitat. Quadrat sampling provides researchers with comparable data because it records data from areas with consistent size and shape. It's a good method for monitoring populations with fixed or slow moving individuals. This method can show trends such as the emergence of a new species over time. But a limitation of this quadrat sampling method is that it's ineffective for organisms that move across wide areas. It's also only useful for a specific region. Transect sampling is another method, and this is where researchers lay down a line through the region under study, and the line is marked at regular intervals, such as every meter. The researcher moves along that line, noting the number of individuals of each species or only the species under study at each interval on the line. Transect sampling is useful for large areas where quadrat sampling isn't practical. A disadvantage of this transect sampling method is that the researcher can miss seeing some individuals, especially if the terrain is uneven and complex. And I think this is our last method, tagging and wildlife tracking. So wildlife tracking is the act of monitoring the movement of organisms in their natural habitat. Scientists will usually tag animals for identification and tracking. And there are different ways you can tag an animal. Bands, colorful bands, visually identify animals, while Transponders emit little radio signals from the animal, and then researchers will have machines that capture that radio signal, and they can tell where the organism is. Tracking and tagging is useful for monitoring an organism over a long period of time. It's useful to monitor changes in the behavior of organisms. A disadvantage of tagging is that it requires capturing the animal for a brief period of time. Tracking is also a time-consuming process and requires equipment such as computers and GPS devices, I suppose. Tracking isn't an efficient method for monitoring very large populations of organisms. So this can be useful for, I suppose, bears, deer, maybe goats. But if there are a lot of organisms in the population, this would not be the correct method. So you can see how different methods are better suited to certain animals and plants even. So that's why they have to use a variety. This asks you to watch a video about Kapunji monkeys in Africa. And then it asks you, if you were a conservationist monitoring the populations of these monkeys, what method would you choose? Explain your reasoning. Now the sample answer says tagging and tracking would be the most effective method of monitoring the monkeys. They are large animals that are quite mobile, so other methods probably wouldn't work as well. And because these monkeys were recently discovered, we likely don't know much about them. This form of monitoring will help us better understand their behavior and resource needs. This information will help us determine exactly what threatens the species so we can determine the best way to conserve the species. So I'll open that video up real quick just to see. Probably turn down the sound, but if you want to watch this on your own, you can. Look at him. Cute. So scientists would try to capture him for a moment, tag him, and then let him back into the wild, and then they would back off, and then they would track his radio signals and see what he needs to live. And then that will give them more information about how to help him, or well, the entire population of these monkeys survive. But yeah, go check out that video if you're interested. And I will move on to this next section. Conservation efforts. Conservation efforts. Ecosystems play a vital role in the survival of humans on Earth. They provide us with important resources for food and shelter. They also provide many elements that make life on Earth possible. When an ecological crisis occurs, there's not always an easy solution to the problem. Like we've discussed, ecosystems are very complex with both living organisms and non-living organisms as a part of their systems. So even the best solutions have negative consequences sometimes. To preserve biodiversity, scientists must focus on all aspects of the ecosystem. And here we have an illustration of an ecosystem. You have fish, water bugs, ducks, ducklings, dragonflies, frogs, lily pads, more foliage, mosquitoes probably, ugh. Gnats, all part of the same system. All right, natural resources. The consumption of natural resources around the world is not evenly distributed. People in developed countries use more natural resources than people in undeveloped countries. Now, developed, I would say countries that are heavily industrialized or urbanized, something like that, something along those lines where there's a lot more production of food or other material because there are more people there usually. Resources that can be replaced over a short period of time, usually within a person's lifespan, are called renewable resources. Renewable resource examples include water, trees, solar and wind energy, livestock, and fisheries. Other resources that have a limited stock and can't be replenished within a person's lifespan are called non-renewable resources. They include rocks, minerals, and fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas, and oil. Now that's because it takes a long time for these to develop. And there's no way you can just create coal, oil, natural gas, and rocks. Just, yeah, even within your lifetime, that's not gonna work. So let's take a look at renewable resources. Humans rely heavily on energy to maintain their modern lifestyle. If you're in a house with air conditioning, if you have a refrigerator, dishwasher, electricity, you're using energy, and it takes a lot of energy to maintain everyone's livelihood, lifestyle. By using renewable energy resources such as wind, solar, hydroelectric energy, people can avoid the polluting effects of fossil fuels and other conventional non-renewable resources. Scientists also consider renewable energy resources to be reservoirs of clean energy because they don't result in burning fuel that releases carbon dioxide or CO2 into the atmosphere. But renewable resources can be expensive and they may have other disadvantages. Dams constructed for hydroelectric power, for example, can destroy habitats and change local ecosystems. Wind turbines may affect birds in some small cases. Solar energy may not be effective in places that are cold and lack sunshine. So no one's saying that renewable resources are strictly positive, but of course they're beneficial. Sustainable resources. Resources that are sustainable are used at a rate at which they can be replaced. So for example, after trees in a forest are cut down, new saplings should be planted so that the forest regenerates. Sustainable use also means limiting the use of resources to not exceed the rate of replacement. But this approach is a challenge with the continued growth of the human population. Limitations on resource use often meet with resistance from industries that depend on those resources for profit. Restrictions on uses of these resources prompt industries to charge more for their products. Well, that's the choice of the company. Is it strictly ethical? I would argue no, but I'll leave that to you to decide. Recycling. So everyone is down with recycling. has a lot of positive consequences, but not everything can be recycled. The process of reusing resources that would otherwise be considered waste is called recycling. Recycling reduces waste and increases the life and usability of a product or its components. Recycling has several benefits. It decreases waste in landfills and reduces pollution. It also conserves natural resources because it doesn't require the use of fresh raw materials for the product. The disadvantages are that some programs and plants are costly to maintain. They require equipment and labor, which you have to pay people to do work. So that is an expense. Recycling requires people to recycle waste instead of throwing it in the trash. This change in behavior can be difficult, especially if you're in a city or town that doesn't have recycling everywhere, as in larger urban areas usually do. Products such as paper, plastic, and glass are easy for people to recycle because collection bins are widespread. But other products such as electronic waste are more difficult to recycle because there are few collection centers. Separate recycling programs need to be devised for such waste. Yeah, so if you ever travel to Europe, like I've been able to, they have different waste baskets for more material than we do. In our, at least in my neighborhood, we just have a recycling bin and it lists what you can put in it and what you can't. I also met another exchange student that was that wondered why there weren't as many battery recycling bins. That is less common in the United States than in other countries I've come to see. Conserving biodiversity. Conservationists use many methods to protect biodiversity around the world. Protected regions, so think of national parks, state parks, things along those lines. In the US and all over the world, governments have established protected areas to conserve biodiversity. National parks in the US are protected areas. They provide legal protection from hunting and destruction of the natural environment. Although protected regions safeguard biodiversity from habitat destruction, they can't protect against outside threats such as climate change and air pollution, unfortunately. Species protection. Conservationists have identified several species that are at risk of becoming extinct. Depending on the degree of threat that these organisms face, conservationists give the species different ratings, such as endangered, vulnerable, or threatened. Species are then given special protection, and in the United States and in other regions of the world, it's illegal to hunt endangered species. Creating wildlife corridors is another way that conservationists protect species. And a wildlife corridor is a protected region that connects two fragmented habitats. And that provides organisms with a means of traveling from one habitat to another. These corridors improve genetic diversity because they increase organisms' chances of finding an unrelated mate. For example, a plan for a highway can include a land bridge for animals that goes over the highway. Then animals can safely cross from one side of the road to another. And here's another example. Passages under railway lines act as traveling routes for animals. So they don't have to risk their lives crossing railway lines. And that ties back into how fragmented populations can lead to a lack of biodiversity. But this connects fragmented habitats and allows them to hopefully thrive. Biodiversity hotspots. Now, hotspots are regions that contain a high number of species that exist only in that region and are threatened by habitat loss. A lot of these regions lie in rainforests. Biologists differ in their opinions about hotspot conservation. Some feel that a species approach to conservation is better. So they feel that working at the species level is a more effective way to go about this. They prefer concentrating their efforts to save threatened species while paying minimal attention to other species in the ecosystem. It's sort of like triage in a doctor's office. They will usually treat people that have the most pressing injuries first, or whatever they're dealing with. And then if you have more minor pain, they'll treat you after they treat the other people. It's sort of like that. Other biologists feel that it's important to preserve the regions as a whole. Although some threatened species may be lost, the ecosystem as a whole will be preserved. These biologists argue that the preservation of whole ecosystems is important for the health of the planet. For example, wetlands prevent flooding. They also act as natural filters of water, and large tracts of forest play an important role in preventing climate change. So there are examples of scientists not completely agreeing on the best solution. Some want to focus on species, others want to focus on the whole region. And if a few threatened species die out, but the ecosystem is preserved as a whole, is that such a negative thing? I don't know. The correct answer is not always clear. And protecting both regions and species may have distinct benefits in preserving balance in an ecosystem. So hopefully you can do both. Protect threatened species and the ecosystem as a whole. And in this left picture, the Amazon rainforest is considered a biodiversity hotspot because of the diversity of the plants and animals. There's so much. If you've ever watched a documentary or some type of TV show about the rainforest, so many colorful, interesting animals and plants there. Now we're getting into restoring biodiversity. Human activity has already depleted biodiversity in many regions of the world, unfortunately. Conservationists have attempted to restore these areas, though, using various methods. And the first one is bioremediation. So if you break that down, bio means life. Remediation is, have you ever heard of remedial? It tends to mean helping things get back to normal or giving additional help to get back to a standard. If you take like remedial classes, that means they are trying to help you get to a standard class or something along those lines. It's like tutoring. Like they're tutoring the biodiversity ecosystem to get back to a normal state of affairs. Think of it like that, a targeted response. So many sites are degraded by pollution. Bioremediation is the process of using living organisms to clean up environmental pollutants from degraded areas. So, for example, microorganisms are used to clean toxic oil spills. Some species of plants can soak up harmful metals from soil. The plants grow in contaminated areas and take in heavy metal pollutants through their roots, trapping them in their biomass. Scientists can then harvest the plants and process them using various methods to recover the metals. The entire operation helps to clean the ecosystem of the pollutants. So, very cool. This is a bioremediation pit, and they can be used to treat oil or to remove oil from contaminated soil. Biological augmentation. Augmentation means you're changing something about the ecosystem. And it's the process of adding predators to an ecosystem in which prey species have grown out of control. It's an effective method of controlling the population of an unwanted species. For example, farmers use ladybugs that prey on aphids to control the aphid populations that destroy crops. The next method is reforestation. So before we talked about deforestation, and this is replanting forests. Planting new trees in the deforested areas. Well, this process is actually pretty time consuming because trees take years to grow to a height and girth that's economically useful. A sustainable way of using this resource is to chop down fewer trees in the forest and then immediately plant new saplings. After a few years, the trees will be large enough to be logged. Logging companies can then rotate their logging activities, and different regions will have trees of different ages growing in the forest. This practice will ensure that a smaller area is deforested. And over here we have cane toads, a cane toad. And that is an example of biological augmentation. They were brought into Hawaii to control the pests there. So, interesting little fact. Now, this activity is, you're imagining you're a conservation scientist, and currently all of the electricity in your area comes from the burning of fossil fuels. The mayor of your town wants to build a hydroelectric dam on the riverbank. The river is home to many species of fish, and it's surrounded by thick woods that are filled with different types of wildlife. You've researched how a hydroelectric dam functions and are concerned that the dam will have damaging effects on the region's biodiversity. So I'll open up that link. So this video talks about a hydroelectric dam and shows you what actually makes it work and how it draws its power. Water comes in through this dam from the reservoir and down through this control gate. And as this water is moving down due to gravity, it will turn this turbine. And that movement of the turbine will go to the generator. and then that water flows out. And this movement caused by the water going from a higher area to a lower area generates power. And that can then be used as any other energy. Generator into the transformer, and we call this the powerhouse. And then we have power lines connected here into your homes, house lights, street lights, whatever. So now once you've looked at that, it's asking, what are your top 3 concerns regarding the dam and the biodiversity of the region? And then pick one of your concerns. Can you think of 2 possible ways a conservationist could address this concern to minimize the risk to biodiversity? You may conduct your own research using credible resources to help formulate your answer. And then evaluate both of your solutions. What are the pros and cons of each solution? Look for the negatives, look for the positives. And then do you think one is clearly better than the other? And then give reasons why. But yeah, it's a good activity for you to come up with your own reasoning and looking at your proposed solutions, and you want to fact check yourself. Like, does this make sense? Which is better? And then give reasons why you think it's better. So now we're moving on to conserving African penguins. Let's take a look. We often think of penguins as Antarctic birds, but there are some species that can live in warmer climates. African penguins live in southern Africa, and they're being threatened by overfishing. African penguins are medium-sized, standing about 2 feet tall. They make a donkey-like braying call and feed on small fish and squid. African penguins are pursuit divers, which means they're anatomically streamlined to swim fast, enabling them to catch prey. There he is. Oh, there we go. The African penguin is listed as an endangered species. Biologists estimate that its population is only 10% of what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So that means back in the early 1900s, there were almost 10 times more than there are today. Earlier, the penguins were threatened by overcollection of eggs for food. But in recent years, overfishing and the dangers posed by oil pollution are the most significant threats to their survival. Conservation efforts include listing the species as protected in various international conventions. Collection of eggs in guano. Guano is the accumulated penguin droppings, which form a rich fertilizer, is illegal. The breeding areas of the African penguins are protected as national parks and nature reserves. Here we have penguins and a little penguin egg. So another video. About African penguins. So they talk about African penguins, and they talk about a conservation effort too. Teach them in a protected environment how to become a penguin capable of surviving. But did you notice any pros and cons to the conservation program? In the sample answer, the conservationists effectively identified a problem, specifically that young penguins were underweight. The conservationists fed the young birds, increasing the probability that they would reach reproductive age. The program also ensured that the young penguins could survive in the wild by teaching them survival skills. And a limitation of this program is that after the birds return to the wild, they face the same problems of high competition and limited food supply. Although the program increases their chances for reproduction, it doesn't guarantee that they'll be successful. So what this answer is saying, although yes, they are better able to survive, the main root problems that are causing that, as in high competition and limited food supply, will still affect them after they leave the program. And then their young will also face the same issues. So is this a sustainable conservation effort? I don't know. I think it's a noble attempt, though. Here's the summary video. And I hope that helped you understand conserving biodiversity and looking at various ways scientists or conservationists try to tackle the problem of biodiversity. We looked at African penguins. We looked at whether a hydroelectric dam is beneficial. What kind of issues would you have with the surrounding environment? But that's a lot of issues you run into in biology or science in general. What's the best course of action? How do you minimize the negative impact on others, on other humans, other animals, the planet? It's all about problem solving and learning and making the best choice we can. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I hope it helped you, and I will see you next time. See ya.